welcome. Very happy to have you all with the U1H2O Lyon for a webinar on the zero state concept of rivers with examples in the United Kingdom. Just a couple of words about H2O Lyon before Antoine talks about the réseau network in Rivière TV. H2O Lyon is a research center which groups research labs in Lyon, in Saint-Étienne in France, work on freshwater rivers, all in all dimensions, from rivers, urban water, underground water tables, lakes, and the objective is to consider four major points. That is, connection between research and training, between research and the concrete issues and problems of the socioeconomic world, as well. We foster and promote international opening and exchange between countries and to discuss various practical cases as well. And we want to foster interdisciplinarity. We do organize regular seminars therefore, to fuel this process. We'd like to mention that we already organized two webinars that had to deal with large wood for living rivers. And so they're still available on the internet on replay. You can flash the QR code you can see here, or with a link which is here, or just by going on the H2O website on the resource, and you will so today we're here to talk about the notion of zero state concept. What is it? What can it, how can it help us? How it's been put to experiment in the UK? And Arnaud Forest, sorry, and Antoine Veroshovsky will be the facilitator of the webinar, and will tell you more about it. Thank you, Claire-Lise. So thank you to all the participants who connected. And today we do have we have with us three experts who use this stage zero concept in the UK. I will be the co-facilitator with Antoine Veroshovsky. I work in the regional council in this region, and I'm also work on the Réseau River TV network. Arnaud. So, hello, my name is Arnaud Forêt. I'm at the end of my Master 2 for integrated sciences, international master we done by H2O, and in the water science study last year, I was fortunate enough to work with Richard Messon in Sweden on the zero stage and the reconnection of floodplains. And on some of the sites we will discover with the speakers today, and based on the works of Colin Thorne with us today. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Antoine to introduce the speakers. So we'll have three speakers. First, George Heritage, who will discuss the general framework of this concept of stage zero, which is will frame the situation. So will be 40 minutes, 20 minutes Q&A. We will not be able to answer all the questions because, of course, you're a large number of listeners, and we'll see how we deal with the questions left unanswered. Then there will be a presentation from Matthew Hemsworth. It will last about 20 minutes with a couple of questions. And who's also you implemented the concept. And then they will have finally the Parr presentation for 20 minutes and question. Then after that, there will be a discussion, a global discussion, which will last 30 minutes. So with no further ado, I might move on to the next slide. So we had 300 participants registered today. So we're very Europe focused, but not only, you see, we got visitors from other parts of the world, and we thank you very much. For some of you, it may be very early or very late. So we'll start with no further ado with George Heritage. George, could you please share your screen and just and then introduce yourself and run your presentation. Your floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully people can see my opening slide. I can't get confirmation of that, I don't suspect, but I shall carry on regardless. Yes, my name is George Harris. I'm a geomorphologist, fluvial geomorphologist. I've been working in rivers for the best part of 40 years. And I got very excited when I was asked to talk about stage zero, and until I started to think about it really, and I realised that I maybe didn't quite understand what it was, and I've subsequently been struggling with it in terms of this presentation. Right. Well, hopefully you can see that slide. As I say, I'm going to talk, I think, a little bit more generically about floodplain restoration and reconnection, and I think it is a vital topic, and it does encompass stage zero. And the reason I say that is, historically, and even to this day, there are a large number of restoration schemes which have very much a focus on the little wet single thread channel that flows across many valley floors everywhere. And in fact, what we should understand is that the river is both that little wet channel and all of the valley floor as well, and those are working together as one, as a functional unit, to create what would be a fully natural system. Now, I was helped actually by the introductory words to this webinar, and I thought that this actually was a very succinct definition of stage zero, because it talks very clearly about the process of naturalization and reconnecting channels to the valley floor and ensuring that natural processes are operating. And I hope that with the slides that follow, that this principle is continues throughout the talk. So just a quick idea of what we're going to cover. I want to look very briefly at the sort of traditional ideas around rivers and flooding and flood frequency. I want to go through the process that I've been through, trying to define exactly what stage zero is. I want to look at how we are maybe advised to achieve stage zero, the process behind that, so the more classic approach from the US, and maybe also looking at ways where we can move towards, if not achieve, stage zero or a fully functional river and valley bottom with other techniques. And I want to do that through some feature-based examples from the UK, and if there is time, to look at the bigger picture schemes that have occurred with full project examples. Now, that first question, do all rivers have floodplains? And I think it's very clear from just these 5 images that the answer to that is no. We have in the top left, obviously, a river with a floodplain. You can see how the river's moved across that floodplain over time, and you can see that it does indeed inundate across the valley floor on occasions. That's the sort of traditional view, I'm sure. But then the next 2, the top middle and top right, you can see a river with a very confined valley and no really well-defined valley bottom, and a river which is cut pretty much into bedrock. So no functional floodplain in that situation. The bottom left shows you a river which has perhaps some functional floodplain, but also a series of terraces which were former floodplains and which now have much less direct river influence, but could have other hydrological influences to valley side processes. And that's also true of the final picture on this slide, where we have a situation where we've got a contemporary watercourse, but we've also got a lot of legacy activity that has gone on the valley floor, most notably here through glaciation. And we've got lots of processes which are operating from the valley sides, which equally influence the valley floor, and I think should be considered as part of a valley floor naturalization or a stage zero approach. Now, as I say, we very often think of restoring our valley bottoms through the main channel that flows through them. And there's been many studies that have looked at the relationship between the perennial flowing river and its surrounding floodplain. And the statistics point to the potential for that valley to be inundated, or the valley floor to be inundated, maybe once every 1.5 to 2 years. And that's a statistic and a goal, if you like, which has pervaded for a very long time. And in my view, it's led to a situation where even when we're restoring that connectivity, we're probably not wetting up the valley floor to any degree like it was prior to human intervention. And of course, with that wetting comes the sort of flow energy and the flow processes that act to renaturalize the whole of the valley floor. We need to take a wider view, I feel, in terms of understanding the potential for valley floor naturalization. And it comes not just from the main river. You can see from the bottom left cross section that flooding from the main river is just one component of getting water across the wider valley floor landscape, and also introducing process back onto that landscape. There is also considerable influence potentially from tributary systems. There is influence from human drain systems, and there is influence from the groundwater, both the sort of regional groundwater from the bedrock and the groundwater water table, which exists within the alluvial sediment that's been deposited in the valley on the bottom. And all of those act or can act to wet the system and to bring back water-based processes which are important for the subsequent ecology. And there is a little diagram at the top there which shows the many, I think, the many different influences, water-based influences on the valley floor, which can be rejuvenated either individually or as part of a bigger scheme, which then leads to widespread naturalization and potentially achieves that sort of or fits the stage zero concept. And there's a picture in the bottom right there, which I thought was good enough to make bigger. And you can see there you've got your valley running through, your river running through the valley floor there, but it doesn't really influence very much of that valley. There's a lot of other processes there, a lot of other hydrological inputs to the system from the valley side, which are leading to tributary fans and flushes and various sort of wetlands developing, which have got very little, if any, connection to the river in the valley bottom itself. But nonetheless, they form very vital components of the functioning of that valley floor system. So to move on to what I find a very tricky situation, the definition of stage zero. Is it an entity? Is it a part of a process, or is it a philosophy? Is it a guiding principle? And I've looked at the literature to try and answer that a little bit. And I know we've got Colin, or at least I hope we've got Colin on the webinar today. his paper with the Clear and Thorne paper was very interesting because it took the original work of Stan Shum in particular, which looked at channel evolution and channel dynamics, basically, from an incised channel system and how it responded with 5 basic stages of further incision and then deposition and widening until we got eventually towards a stable state in stage 5. Now that can be seen on a cross section at any one point, and it can also be seen as you move along a valley system, as those processes are operating to change in the upstream direction. Now, with the Clear and Thorne concept, they've revisited that and they've added some nuances. And I think one of the key extras is this idea of a pre-human state of our river and valley floor systems. And you can see I've highlighted it there. They've geomorphologically identified that stage 0 as anastomosing wet woodland or anastomosing grassland wetland areas, and fundamentally a multi-thread channel system. And that's got a lot of scientific backing. There's been particular work by Tony Brown looking at the historic record preserved in floodplain sediments, and there is very, very strong evidence that prior to human interference, there were large areas of our watercourses which were multi-thread, and they only became a single thread system predominantly post our interventions. So there is that idea that we need to go back, or a natural system would be multi-thread rather than an imposed single thread style. And Clear and Thorne go on to continue the cycle, if you like, on the stage 0 with the possibility of naturalization back towards an anastomosing system at stage 8, which, for all intents and purposes, at least from my probably fairly naive viewpoint, matches the stage 0 situation with 1 or 2 constraints which still exist. So it looks from that like we are moving towards a definition. Looking at the papers in a bit more detail, I think there are some key points that come out, and that's highlighted in red here. It's a process thing as well, and the stage 0 situation is one where the river has adjusted to the catchment context. So the prevailing drivers are those which are influencing the current river form, and that basically means that it's self-sustaining, and so you have an appropriate channel form, and the ecology is able to adjust to that. In terms of its, the geomorphological context, it's not just that little wet river, it's the river wetland corridor, so basically the entire valley floor, which is something we touched on at the very start. And it may be multi-threaded, which could be braided, it could be wandering, it could be anastomosed. And there is also the potential for some single thread systems, but with not a uniform single thread style, but ones with much more diversity in terms of the overall plan form. And they're not ubiquitous. They are likely to occur or should occur in areas where we have sediment accumulated across the valley floor, and they're interrupted by transport reaches are likely to be more confined and bedrock influenced. So I think I'll go back. A quick summary there. It's essentially a wet river corridor probably predominantly multi-thread, and it's certainly something which is adjusted to the current controls. But that doesn't mean that it's stable. There's often and should be dynamism involved in the form of the channel and valley floor that is produced. So we are basically, as the words which introduced this seminar say, reconnecting the river to its floodplain. I'd slightly change that, and I think I would prefer to say that in achieving this, we are trying to rejuvenate and all of the hydrological processes which should be operating across the valley floor. So let's have a look at very quickly, a couple of classic examples. These are all from America. They are large scale. They have been quite interventionist. They use a lot of wood as instigators of change, and they've certainly resulted in very, very significant development of a naturalized valley floor. We've tried it in the UK on a smaller scale, and we've also employed wood. This is a section which Matt Hemsworth, I believe, is going to be talking about later on, so I won't go into any detail on this, but it's the same principles, but fundamentally on a smaller scale. Now, how is that achieved? We've got to go from this disconnected floodplain system through to one which is fully connected. And the philosophy in the literature says that we have to work with natural processes, and that's absolutely right. If we don't link process to form, the subsequent restoration will fail. And very, very much the key is that we have to think beyond the river channel. So, when you're looking at the river, always turn around, look at what's behind you, and try to reconnect everything across that valley floor landscape. Now, there's a paper by Parr et al. Which guides or provides guidance to achieving stage 0. And it has influenced a number of stage 0 projects in the UK in particular. And key to that is if you like stage 5, there is an approach where you look for areas in the valley floor which are above what's known as a sort of a grade line, an average surface, and you look for those areas which are below, and you then look at cutting where elevations are above and filling where elevations are below to create this grade line across the surface. And that's illustrated in this example where we have variation in the elevation in this case in the downstream direction, and a grade line which shows potential cutting and filling activity. And you can see that as well in the image on the left, where we have used LiDAR to identify areas which are above and below that grade line, and which would require cut and fill to get back to that flat surface. Now, I think what's interesting is if you look at the wording in the final section of Parr et al., and they say that the cut and fill areas should be identified, but the priority should be given to preserving natural surfaces and native materials in the landscape. And it's that subtlety which I think potentially gets missed in some stage 0 restoration projects, because there are a large number of features within the valley floor landscape which still exist and could be rejuvenated, but potentially are ignored if we just go for this fully flat surface. Now, I want to go through a few of those because I think there are alternative ways of reconnecting which can achieve very much the this idea of wetting and the hydrological restoration. And the way to do it, or the way we have done it, is to first of all look at the situation as we have at the moment. So we have, just about everywhere got very highly degraded river systems. They are engineered beyond anything that could be described as natural. And that engineering extends beyond the main river to go up the tributaries and across the valley floor through drainage and through culverts. So a very, very highly engineered, highly managed system that we tend to encounter all of the time now. But importantly, underneath that engineering, there is preserved in the landscape most of the natural features that used to function before we intervened. So we have confluence fans, we have bifurcations, we have splays, we have anastomosing areas, fans, you name it really. But all of them are non-functional because we have altered the system to such a degree. But if you overlay the two, then we can actually look for targets for rejuvenation of those fossilized features. And that's what we try to do with a number of schemes. So at a feature scale, for instance, where we've taken our tributaries and we've put them underground in terms of culverts, it's a very simple process to block that culvert and bring all of that water back to the surface. And then that water will flow across the natural landscape, or the best of the landscape that is left, to start to recreate seepage zones, flushes, and potential fans across the valley bottom. And examples of those with very simple blocking of those culverts are seen here. The recreation, redevelopment, rejuvenation, whatever you want to call it, of valley side seepage ponds, the development of the multi-channel, very diffuse wetland flow that you can see across this little fan area, and more significant output onto the landscape, including sediment as well in the last figure. We also see in many areas areas of wetland which are overdrained, over dry, and are maintained in that way. But if you take away that drainage, and in particular if you also introduce features back into the main channel which bring the water level up, then you can start to rejuvenate those wetland areas as backwater wetlands or flowing wetlands. And an example of that here comes from the Scarrow Beck, which is a tributary to the River Bure in Norfolk, where 3.5 kilometers of that river were rejuvenated simply by reintroducing 12 riffles in a very low gradient system, which brought water levels up and re-wetted very significant areas of the valley floor. And interestingly, the engineered drainage was used to our advantage because we put it into reverse, if you like. Instead of draining the water off, it took water then from the river and brought it onto the landscape and spread that water more widely. There are significant opportunities around the reconnection of old channel lengths, paleo channels, particularly where they intersect with the current river. And it's very often a relatively simple process to remove embankments or create chute channels, which create that direct connection from the current river back into its old channel. And examples of that are seen here. This is one from the Lake District at Harsop, where the embankment was removed on the right bank there, and water was allowed to flow back into what is a wetland fan area at the top of Brothers Water. That spread very, very significantly across a very wide area, creating actually an anastomosing system, which is very difficult to see because they are very shallow, diffuse channels. And it then starts to cut a single, more dominant channel that you can see bending across the landscape to the top right. As well as bringing water onto the landscape through that sort of approach, it also reconnects and rejuvenates the sediment dynamics and sedimentary processes. So material is no longer just transported straight down the wet channel. It's pushed onto the valley floor. It starts to create a number of features. It helps to gravel up new channels, and basically reintroduces a set of features which are totally lost in the managed valley floor situation in the UK. And there's another larger example from a lowland system where water was reintroduced from the top end of the scheme, and with a couple of extra cutting of deeper pond areas. Interestingly as well, we can reversing the impacts that we've had on those tributaries to start to recreate the effects of natural tributary functioning across valley floors. So from the valley margin, from the valley sides, right through to the main channel. So that would involve, interestingly, as we've found, some very simple interventions, which is basically to take away the side of the channel, one side or both sides. They're often perched because of an over deposition of sediment along a managed channel line. And what that means is as soon as you let the water out, it goes off and it follows perhaps an old fan channel route, or spreads as a more diffuse set of flow across the landscape. So very, very simple intervention, very cheap, but you can see here where it's come out on the left side of this tributary on Swindale Beck, that it starts to form some surface channels, then it goes into a very diffuse, hard to see set of anastomosing diffuse wetland channels before it congregates again further down towards the bottom and follows probably one of the old paleo tributary routes back into the main channel. And another one here, you can see how the bank has just been taken away, and the spread of water from what was effectively a ditch, or certainly a very uniform tributary, has now spread and dispersed across a very wide area of that valley floor. And this doesn't involve interventions in the main channel whatsoever. If you don't want such dramatic impacts, it's possible to rejuvenate paleo channel routes in particular in the backward direction, so to recreate them as backwaters. And you can see there a much lower energy style of system is developed once you connect backwards into old paleo systems. And drainage is ubiquitous, surface and subsurface, but simple blocking of, and strategic blocking in particular, of those drainage systems can then rejuvenate large areas of the valley floor as well. And you can see here the drains taken out in that system has resulted in widespread spreading of water across the landscape. So if you put all of those interventions together, and none of them are particularly onerous, you end up with a system which is starting to go back towards, if not fully, naturalized in terms of its hydrological functioning, and through that also, most likely, its sort of sediment functioning as well. And a few examples, I showed you this one a little bit earlier, that's Cowsby Beck, and there's some closer shots of the works that were done. As you can see, it's relatively interventionist. It was interventionist to create those additional pools, some of which are permanent, some of which are seasonal. Whilst that may be not, exactly along the stage 0 lines, might be a little bit too interventionist, certainly for my liking. You have to go along with some of the client requests as well. A very nice example in the Lake District on rapid that was reintroduced into the reconnected one of the paleo routes, and you can see that one intervention has then spread water as channels that you can see, so fairly significant channels, but also lots and lots of channels that you can't see, but which has basically wetted the whole of that valley floor. And that's following natural features that were preserved in the landscape. Back, you sediment, as we said before, and large wood, and lots of finer organics which are accumulating across that valley bottom. Swindale Foot was again a single intervention which brought water up and into the 2 fields that you can see there. The wetting is very clear in the bottom picture. It's predominantly in that first field, but it goes right through into the second field as well. And this is developing spectacularly well at the moment. And the biotic response is equally spectacular. The number of juvenile fry and parr fish that have been recorded there is astronomical, far better than in the original channel. And that's linked to a very significant uplift in invertebrate species, and the amphibian life there is also improving significantly. Scarabäck is the long restoration with 12 riffles that I told you about earlier on. You can see again a couple of images which show you close, going to inevitably lead for a lowland system dynamic wetland environment. Gold Rilbeck was more interventionist, but nonetheless it rejuvenated a significant area of wet woodland purely by reducing the size of the main channel, such that it effectively forced the river to flood out and to inundate through that wet woodland on a very frequent basis, certainly several times every winter, and occasional high summer flows as well. And once again, that connectivity is leading to very significant ecological response. And then Geltstall, which is on the border of England and Scotland. This was a mixed bag because they wanted a wiggly river from a straight river. So there was a bit of a wiggle put in, and it looks awful from the air, but on the ground, there is nonetheless much better habitat created there. But the really important intervention was bringing water back onto the floodplain on the left as you look at it, and the creation of that flowing anastomosing wetland system. It's very interesting. When you start to make these interventions, you obviously change the hydrology and you change the sediment transport regime, often to an extent where there is significant change associated with the move towards a more natural system. And there is, as you can see here from example on the River Glen, very rapid, really and truly very rapid change linked to the reconnection of the floodplain. In particular, you have large-scale deposition of gravels both on the valley floor, but also in the main channel. And when you start to get that deposition in the main channel, it has a hydrological and a hydraulic influence upstream, which leads to further deposition. So there is a feedback mechanism which is operating on this system now, which is diversifying the channel upstream of the works in a very significant way. And when you compare the picture on the top right, which was the managed single thread system, to the exceptionally diverse wandering system that we have starting to develop on the River Glen, then I think that's testament to a job well done, as far as I'm concerned. It's something that we should be doing. This is what this river would naturally have done, and it is now able to start to do that again, thanks to the interventions that were carried out. And there's increasing evidence now of how these naturalization schemes are improving the ecology. There is a lag, obviously, in terms of ecological response, but we're seeing, associated with an enormous uplift in geomorphic variation and variety, change in substrate, and in this case here, very significant positive response in terms of the fisheries. So, these approaches improve the morphology, they improve the sedimentology, they improve the dynamics, and as a result, the ecology improves. So, hopefully I've stuck to time. I can't see a clock, but I think we need to just draw out a couple of things that stage 0, or this valley bottom hydrological restoration, has to consider this little wet river that we're so obsessed with, and the rest of the valley bottom, and all of the hydrological processes that should be operating. And once you can see those and you work with those, you will develop a successful rejuvenation. I hope that I've illustrated that there's more than one way to wet the valley floor and to restart valley floor processes through more targeted interventions. The systems that start to develop are most definitely dynamic, even in lowland systems, and they are most definitely self-sustaining. We certainly do not aim to go back and tinker with anything of the projects that we've done in the past. You've hopefully seen that both morphology and ecology significantly improves, and it doesn't have to be at a grand scale. We can work on the scale of a couple of fields, or if we're lucky, several kilometers. Even in the UK, we haven't done much more than 3 or 4, to be honest. But the overall conclusion that I come to is, when you're particularly trying to get these things accepted, is that we must explain to people that we are, in this process, reintroducing dynamic systems back into our landscapes, and change must be expected, and, as it says there, change must be embraced. Certainly the ecology and nature is doing that. We just need to bring people along with it. And that's me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, George. There's 2 questions in line with your presentation, or connected to your presentation. First, insist that what's specific of the work presented is that at the level of the obstacles like dikes, banks, drain, we block or we cut a bank to allow water to flow. But in the graphs of work, you didn't talk about the reopening of channels as such. The river will run freely and choose its own pathway in the plain, and therefore comes the question of the fish dynamics continuity at the regulatory level, at the scientific level. Is this a concern where we could be told, well, since of course there is no main channel bed, how will the fish deal with this?
Yes, we have had a number of debates, shall we say, with fisheries and anglers that there are several factors that we've observed. First of all, practically, there is no need to block completely the main channel as it exists at the moment. It's perfectly possible to split the flow for whatever proportion you feel is acceptable to fisheries, etc., and maybe put 30, 40, 50% of the flow back onto the floodplain and leave the rest in the old channel, in which case there is very unlikely to be fisheries concerns. Movement should be possible, and habitats should be maintained. The other thing that we have found is even when we do not cut formal channels, that there are small channels, the anastomosing systems that start to develop. They are of different sizes. So you may have noticed that in a number of the aerial photographs that I showed, there are some channels are more dominant than others. Some channels are deeper. Some channels are allowing fish to move straight away. Other channels start to develop over time with the loss of some of the topsoil, some of the vegetation, and the exposure of gravels, etc. And that, whilst we have to maybe wait for a few floods, eventually leads to a fluvial system which is valley floor wide, and the number of channels which are utilizable by not just for migration or fish movement, but also as habitat for spawning and as a habitat for fry and parr, is many times better than existed in the engineered channel that we've moved the system from. And there is also very good evidence to show that during floods, with the increased connectivity, that the species present in the river aren't subjected to the same level of stresses in terms of flow velocities, etc., which would flush them out of the system in the current engineered channel situation. Instead of that, they have a myriad of possible areas where they can, and refuge, where they can just basically maintain their position in the landscape effectively, and they are not washed away. So they're then there to continue to grow and to continue to support a much stronger, much more resilient fish population into the future. So there's increasing evidence now of the value of these multi-thread whole valley systems as much more robust than anything that we have in an engineered channel.
Thank you, George. So then we have two questions that comes into one in French, one in English. It's about owner agreement, because as we've seen, stage 0 can take up a lot of space on the floodplain. Did those projects struggle with owner agreements and property and stuff like that? And also, what were the measures to deal with that problem, if there were one, and like by buying land or giving subsidies?
Yes, Arnold. My connection cut out a little bit there, but I think it was around landowner agreement and buy-in.
Yes.
Yes, which is a ubiquitous problem, and it exists not just with the landowners being affected by the scheme, but also those that live up and downstream. They have concerns, and the wider community have concerns, because we live in a society where people have become very used to accepting degraded river and valley systems as natural, and that's a problem that we have to face every day. But the processes that we go through in terms of the modelling of these particular potential schemes has to demonstrate that there is no detrimental effect in terms of flooding, in particular, upstream and downstream. And it also gives the landowner who maybe is wavering or is not fully on board an indication of where the new impacts, the new river, will operate, and they can then think about how they can use that land and utilize the traditional approach of managing the land and farming the land very much against natural river processes. So we are seeing slowly but surely a fairly large number of payments, stewardship payments for the river, and the payment levels are both very generous and run over a long period of time, so over 20 years. So there is guaranteed money of a certain level for the landowner for that period if they sign up to the allowing the river to do what we say it's going to do, basically. And as always, money does influence very, very strongly, and the reduction in single farm payments now in the UK, which is probably one of the only decent things to come out of Brexit, is forcing farmers to move towards considering using their land in a more sensible way for the river and ecologically. So there is a positive there.
Thank you. We'll take one last question and then we have to move on because there will be other presentations later on will come up in addition to yours. Now, at the national level, you talked about the agricultural aspect. Payments are being made, so compensations for. Now, were there discussions at the national level? Is there kind of a national council of river systems or farmers and river systems to calculate the compensation of payments? How did you how did you end up with this state contribution system?
Yes, there is a sort of a hierarchical system which exists certainly in England, where we have an organisation called DEFRA, which and the Rural Payments Agency, which link together to come up with schemes where we can see ecological benefits, and those those benefits, those ideas are being driven by an organisation called Natural England in particular, who are the scientists, if you like, who regulate and monitor our natural environment in England. So they work closely together to devise the schemes, and also to a large degree to agree and implement those schemes. And then there are further monies that come from the Environment Agency to conduct the capital works for these schemes. So there is a system is grossly underfunded, sadly, optimal rate. But I think it all depends on government, doesn't it? I don't. But well, I'd love to get into politics, but it probably won't be a good thing on this call. We're in the hands, unfortunately, of the politicians, and most politicians are career politicians now, so they only see the next 5 years as being important. whereas we have to be thinking about this with a you know, a much more sensible and much longer term perspective. And we can only hope that will come in time. It's not quite there at the moment.
George, thank you very much. We move on. There will probably be other questions in the discussion at the end of the presentations anyway. So I will now call on Matthew. Matthew, can you share your screen?
Hello, everybody. I am Matthew Hemsworth, Technical Director at JBA Consulting in the UK. I'm a geomorphology specialist with experience working on river restoration projects throughout the UK, Europe and Africa. Thank you very much to George for providing a good introduction to floodplain reconnection. I'm now going to discuss my experience of delivery schemes in the UK. So today's webinar aims to provide an introduction to floodplain reconnection, or stage 0, and how it has been implemented in the UK. Hopefully after today's session you will understand a little more about the methodologies used, the importance of understanding geomorphological processes to identify solutions, and how you can overcome common challenges. We will cover several topics in today's session, and I will use 2 case studies where I will provide an explanation of the implementation of stage 0, and I'll look at different techniques which have been used to implement the schemes. I will also outline the importance of understanding geomorphological processes when developing river restoration options, and I will discuss common challenges, successes and outcomes. The first case study which I will discuss is a River Aller floodplain reconnection project in the UK. The scheme successfully won the UK River Prize in 2025 and has created over 7 hectares of new wetland habitat. The river system prior to restoration was typical of many river systems within the UK landscape. The river and floodplain had been historically modified and managed over a long time period. This had led to an over deep river channel and poor floodplain connectivity, as we can see in the photograph. Post-river restoration, an anastomose multi-thread wetland channel system has developed. Groundwater levels have increased in height, and the wetted area of the river and floodplain have increased by over 70 meters. We can understand the transition using Kluwer and Thorne's channel evolution model, which outlines a transition of a river system over time, as George covered in his presentation. We can see in the case of River Aller, we have transitioned from a stage 2 to 4 point to an anastomosed multi-thread system back to stage 0 as a result of the river restoration works. Now we can better visualize the change using the descriptive sketches which we can see here. So for the River Aller, the objective was to move from a modified state, which had historically led to a single incised channel forming with the loss of the wetland areas, loss of the floodplain connectivity. And we aim to move to a scenario with a restored water table, a greater diversity of processes across a floodplain, a wide mosaic of habitat, and greater resilience to both flooding and drought. Here we can see an example of the river channel pre-restoration. At this time, it was in a process of adjustment following the failure of historic riverbank protection, which was leading to lateral erosion. And again, this links back to the stages of 2 to 4 in the cycle. And again, some more examples here of what that site was like. So a very almost barren landscape, historically heavily grazed, heavily modified, all for agricultural reasons. and that the channel was pushed to one side and neglected. As with any river restoration project, the first stage of a design process to progress from a single thread river channel to an anastomosed system involves a series of desk and field studies. In this case, this included creating a relative elevation model of the valley floor. This allowed for the identification of historic paleo channels and helped identify areas within the floodplain to excavate and sections of the river channel to fill in order to improve floodplain connectivity and encourage the anastomosed multi-thread channel development. Here we can see a sample cross-section which has been drawn through the river valley. This was in the early conceptual design stages. I've identified using the blue line what we could call a target elevation, which ties into the existing floodplain features such as historic paleo channels which were observed. And in simple terms, we can then use the identified target elevation to begin developing a series of areas to excavate and infill to improve floodplain complexity and connectivity, but also avoiding that flat valley bottom which we see on that blue line. So this tool and type of analysis is a useful starting point in the design process, alongside field-based geomorphological observations and other tools such as hydraulic modelling, but it is only just one tool in that wider design development process. Finally, here we can see how the outputs from the relative elevation model can be utilised to map excavation and fill areas across the floodplain in a targeted way. So the relative elevation model is just a tool which needs to be adjusted, and we need to try to preserve key site features when we're using types of tools, in this case preserving existing paleo channels which already existed, and also understanding those wider catchment and geomorphological processes along the way. All projects have their challenges, and using this type of restoration technique in the UK produced many new challenges because it involved infilling large sections of the river channel, and in the UK this is a relatively new technique. This required good planning and communication to help people understand the aims and objectives of the project by the National Trust, who are the lead landowner in this case. And communication methods included the production of landscape visualizations and hydraulic modeling to demonstrate what the site could look like and how it would adapt into the future. This was linked to explaining to different groups ranging from regulators to the local community about the construction methods, the phasing of the works, and future site evolution. One particular concern centered around the speed at which the groundwater table would respond, whether the channel downstream may run dry, and the impact upon fish passage and habitat. To combat the concerns, careful collaboration with the regulator was needed, pre-works monitoring was undertaken, a good geomorphological understanding of the catchment was gained, 2D hydraulic modelling was carried out, and wider evidence was gathered to provide the assurances needed and to feed into the design development process. Subsequently, the groundwater levels recharged very quickly and fish passage has not been impacted. Instead, a wide-ranging and more abundant habitat has been created. I'll now run through a series of photographs to show how the site has changed. Here we can see the site at the beginning of the construction works. We can see areas of floodplain excavation. A phase approach to construction was carried out and a buffer was maintained along the river channel edge until a temporary water diversion was constructed that allowed construction works in channel then to be conducted, and controls on fine sediment mobilization to be controlled. Here we can see a close-up of one section of the channel pre-works, and this demonstrates the narrow nature of a single fret channel which was there. And the same shot post-works, here we can see the vast change and increase in wetland area. Hopefully you can see the array of small multi-fret channels weaving across the floodplain. These all vary in depth and size, and also in flow energy. In this image, we're looking downstream. We can see the single thread tree-lined river channel and the grazed landscape. And I've marked on here the original channel route. And in this image, post-restoration, we can see a wide expanse and a mosaic of wetland and anastomosing habitat which has developed. We can overlay the original channel route onto the image again. We can also see woody materials being placed throughout the site. This was principally used to encourage multiple flow paths and encourage greater habitat diversity. In addition, the National Trust, who manage the site, have planted thousands of saplings, and the site will continue to evolve over many years. When we look closer, we can see that varied mix of habitat and hydraulic conditions. We can see deeper and slower areas. We can see small channels with elevated flow. These are all broken up by the woody material. And we can also see widespread backwater areas which provide that valuable habitat for an array of different species. And of the areas of the backwater areas, we can see lots of pools which vary in different depths, but some of these depths of pools are over a meter deep, and also some are very, very shallow. Here we can see how the woody material is helping to add complexity. It's worth noting that various methods to install the woody material were followed, including pinning, burying, stacking. There was an anticipation that some of this woody material would move, and that was accepted by the regulators. And luckily for this river restoration scheme, the landowner had a good supply of woody material, and almost a greater abundance was actually used on the site than was probably needed as part of the design. It's also worth noting what happens at the downstream end of the site, because this is often a common question. At the downstream end of the site, the river transitions back into a single thread channel at the point of a natural channel constriction. The transition point is controlled by the placement of woody material to reduce in-channel velocity. In addition, a gravel feature is installed to allow access for the landowner across the river, which also acts as a useful transition feature. Luckily, at the site, the overall gradient is low. Therefore, the gravel feature is not essential. However, for steeper sites, the transition feature will need careful thought to ensure no negative response is experienced. It's also worth noting that we should try to avoid large artificial structures at downstream tie-in points when we're working on these types of schemes, because these may require long-term maintenance and could be subject to future failure, which may jeopardize the success of your scheme. In addition, by forcing an artificial transition feature into the river, you could also have a consequence of a negative geomorphological response happening. Therefore, it's really important to get this right and to understand the geomorphological and hydraulic processes happening at a catchment level and also within your local reach level. For the River Alice scheme, we utilise 2D hydraulic modelling to aid the design development by analysing velocities and shear stresses to help us understand the future likelihood for morphological change. And just some annotations there of some of those key features at that transition point. And finally, for the ALA scheme, we now have the outcomes of some initial monitoring, which has been led by Richard Mason. This demonstrates hydrological reconnection of the floodplain in both width and height over a large area. We see over 70 meters of increased valley bottom floodplain connectivity. The restoration has reconnected the river channel with the floodplain, creating over 7 hectares of new wetland. Downstream hydrological monitoring pre and post restoration by the University of Exeter can quantify if stage 0 has had significant impact on flow regimes, and the early results following the restoration show peak flows have reduced and storm lag times have increased, giving the early indication that this stage 0 scheme is slowing the flow, but more monitoring is still needed over the coming years to give us much more data. There's also a significant visible increase in biodiversity and abundance across the site, and there is an ongoing monitoring and adaptive management plan in place, led by the landowner, which will continue into the future for a number of years. The second example, which I'll briefly cover, is a slightly different floodplain reconnection approach to that used on the River Aller. In this example, 2 different approaches were taken at a small site in North Devon in the UK. This involved creating a chute channel and also infilling a channel with significant amounts of woody debris or woody material. An important aspect of this project, and this applies to all projects, is understanding the geomorphological processes at your site in order to design a solution which works with the processes and is sustainable and successful into the future. At this site, we had 2 distinctly different functioning watercourses, and the application of one approach across a whole site was not appropriate. Therefore, the importance of working with those geomorphological processes and developing a suitable design was key, alongside understanding the cost implications to the client and aiming to minimize ecological disturbance of the site during the construction works. Here is an example of one of the watercourses before construction. In this case, it wasn't deemed appropriate to infill the channel due to the active sediment regime and also the steep site gradient. We can see there quite coarse sediment, we can see lateral erosion, we can see that channel's responding in that situation. So instead of using the infill approach as was taken on the Aller, 2 different approaches were taken in this case. Firstly, for the small tributary, which is running north to south in the image here, a chute channel was created to allow water to naturally spill onto the floodplain. It's a relatively minimal intervention. And secondly, for the main river running west to east, extensive use of woody material, all locally sourced and felled to create log jams, was proposed to allow for a natural capture of sediment and reconnection of the floodplain. Again, relatively low-tech solutions. So here we can see the connection onto the floodplain utilizing the chute channel. This involved breaking through an old historic embankment and then allowing water to naturally dissipate onto the floodplain. It's worth noting that this image was taken quite soon after the works were completed on the ground, so the ground is still quite bare in this photograph. And here we can see an aerial view of the site. We can see the old chute channel route to the left and the reconnection floodplain in the center of the image. We can also see a traversing channel to the bottom of this photograph. This was slightly separate to the originally designed scheme. It was added by the client to try and allow water to spread more towards the the far side of the floodplain. This may or may not require more adaptive monitoring and change in the future. And then finally, the second method which I had mentioned involved using local woody material to create natural channel blockages. This low-tech and low-cost solution has successfully captured sediment and is acting to raise the channel bed level within that active system. And in some cases, we've seen sediment being collected and the bed being raised by over a metre. The photograph to the right highlights the variation in sediment transport and deposition. Large volumes of gravel and cobbles have been captured by the log jams, and the channel is evolving. Now, in this case, we're quite lucky. There was no real receptors or risk downstream, and it was acceptable to the regulator to use log jams and significant amounts of wood. So finally, some concluding thoughts to end with. We must understand geomorphological processes at both a catchment and local reach scale to help inform our design decisions. Stage 0 or floodplain reconnection involves several different methods, and we must use our skills and expertise to choose what is most appropriate for our site. Our understanding of our site's history is key. It's really important we understand how that site has been modified and how it's changed in the past. We must understand that rivers evolve and change, and we should give rivers space to change rather than try and constrain them and fix them in position. And finally, monitoring is really important so that we can continue to learn into the future. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Really good presentation. And we actually, during the time you were talking, we had a lot of questions. And I'm going to start by one or two that are kind of related. We could see on the first other site that there were a lot of interventionism, a lot of heavy machinery. Was it not easier to go towards paleo channels rather than filling back of the channel? And second part of the question, was the log placement really on purpose, or they were placed here randomly?
Yeah, okay, good questions. For the case of the River Aller, the paleo channels were not always very, very well defined. I think probably due to past floodplain modifications. Where possible, we aim to excavate to levels which then tied into historic paleo channels. But also because the channel was so incised, the challenge was, or there was a very big challenge on how to get water out into the floodplain. That was one big problem, and the solution was to utilize the channel to infill to get the cut in the balance, and that's what we managed to achieve. For the wood, two approaches were taken for the wood. So at the downstream point, the wood and the placement of wood was key to allow velocities to be reduced at that transition point. Throughout the rest of the site, wood was placed in a relatively ad hoc way to give us diversity, to encourage flows to break up, but with the anticipation that wood could be moved. So it wasn't an exact science in terms of its placement throughout the site. And I think in some cases probably we wouldn't have had to use so much wood if we were to do it again. I think we could have probably used less wood.
Another question which has to do with the Q value of the river, how the river can recreate the channels. Is this a high flow rate river, or are there low flow rate rivers in plains? And the fact that you're creating blockages or wood, despite the flow, the limited flow rate, the process will take place naturally. How did you work that?
Yeah. Okay. So the river is quite flashy. It's quite a steep headwater, but relatively low in terms of discharge during most conditions. What we have seen is a good development of multi-threat channels, which have evolved quite quickly across the site, post works, and these are quite evenly spread. And some work did go on in the early planning stages to try and balance the initial split of flow across that site, but with the anticipation that that would change over time.
In addition, once the site has been re-wetted, it might be difficult to act again. Since where wood would rot, are you likely to replace the wood or the and so you bring wood initially, and some of this wood maybe may migrate to other locations which are not maybe appropriate. Will you anchor some upstream, downstream that would block those from upstream, or is it an open free system because there is no risk of such nature?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's a relatively open and free system. Some of the wood was pinned at the downstream area just to give us some more confidence. But the natural constriction point further down from the site also gives us the confidence that the wood's not going to travel any further beyond the site itself. The question regarding the rotting of the wood, that again, that is anticipated. The landowner have undertaken significant tree planting across the site. So in the longer term, we would be seeing the rejuvenation of wood, but I think that's thinking well into the future.
One last question. What is the oldest project you've shown us? I mean, how long have you been doing this stage zero project? Do you know any international project where there would be older projects which can prove that that evidence that it works in the long term?
Yeah. So the River Aller project was completed in 2022, 2023. And the second example, which I showed, was completed in 2024. So very new project within the UK. Now, I think for the River Aller scheme, where we infill the channel, that's definitely a quite a unique methodology in the UK. However, if we look at some of the examples which George was discussing, there are a lot more examples using those techniques going back a longer time period to draw upon. And also the same for the second example, which we looked at in Devon, where we looked at the shoot channel creation and the use of woody material. Although those methods were implemented only last year, we see much more evidence based to support those types of interventions.
Just before moving to that, now, concerning the environment, how quick do you see results in terms of evolution of the environment on the zone you modify?
Yeah, this was really interesting. The bounce back we saw after the scheme was implemented was very, very quick in terms of months. We saw vegetation regrowth. We saw the site transition in terms of new habitats being created, and that was very surprising. It was a slight unknown. We could draw upon evidence from over in America where we'd seen similar schemes respond quite quickly, but it was a slight unknown of how well it would respond and change in the UK. But we did see results and return to habitat and vegetation growth very, very quickly.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We move on to Matt now. Matt, you're on. So share your screen and you're on. Thank you.
I'm Matt Parr, and I work as a geomorphologist in Lincolnshire and Northamptonshire, in the sort of the lowlands of the East Midlands. And we're going to see some different examples of an approach to stage zero in general, because we have very different rivers to that of those that you've seen so far, which have been slightly more gradient and upland and gravel rich. So we have a mixture of rivers across our area. It's very low lying, so we have everything from sort of groundwater fed systems like the limestone and chalk through to the fenland systems, which would have been probably an example of a very large stage zero, which was lost relatively recently to agricultural drainage. And what we're going to do is we're going to run through some of the projects that we've delivered, and some of the biological drivers and the restoration results effectively. So what you can see here on the images is pre and post restoration. So the river's been pushed across to the valley side and dug remarkably deep to try and drain what was an old wetland. And you can see from the very dry grass that's there and the little thin strip of green that's running through that impacts on the hydrology. And then the image to the right is what it looks like after the channel's been infilled and the landscape's been re-wetted effectively. And this again would have been sort of the old wetland that would have existed prior to their attempts to drain it. You'll notice that I've got something at the top for names, and I'll kind of explain this. So I found when I was dealing with the general public that the name stage zero itself became more complicated explaining the channel evolution model than it was to just change the name slightly to valley floor re-wet or an anti-drainage. That seemed to capture the imagination better with landowners and people I met with, rather than sort of having to perhaps explain geomorphology to them. So yeah, they got that quicker. So forgive me if I keep referring to that rather than stage zero. To me, they're sort of synonymous. So next slide is what we're dealing with on the Witham catchment, which is where the project was carried out. So you can see there from the river photo on the left that the river has a very high fine sediment bed load. It's the colour of tea. That's because there's lots of clays dissolved as well as sands coming down. And in some of our rivers, they went through a slightly different process, because some of our rivers were sort of subject to isotopic bounce and glaciation. So what we saw on some of this is taken from the Nene, the image on the right, is that over time you get floodplain alluviation, and this can trap the river in a state of incision. And this is really important because looking at that bed load, it means that your alluvium that's overlaying the historic sand and gravels is likely to be clays. So it gives you an idea of what you're going to restore to over time. If your sediment load is clay, well, it's probably going to be clay or sand. It's probably not going to go back to gravel. So it's important to note that. And this, I think, to me, is where the magic happens. So I see stage zero as much as a ecological state as I do a geomorphological state. And that's because in these sort of low energy, low gradient, low stream power environments, the power of biology cumulatively is far more powerful than that of the occasional bankful event or the duration of that bankful event. Because all the animals, plants, everything that lives within the river is driving cumulative change. And these rivers tend to work in a way that the morphology is actually driven by the ecology. So things like fallen trees then drive lateral movement or sediment resupply or various other things. And as they drive those changes, that then creates vacant niches, which then ecology then occupies and completes the circle. So these slides are what I would call natural stage zero reference reaches that exist still currently. And again, they're all biologically related. Like, it's biology that's causing this, it's the biology that's stabilizing this, it's the biology that's also driving the change. So a really important feature on my limestone rivers is tufa. So it's a complex freshwater reef, if you will, as an analogy. It's a mixture of everything from protozoas, viruses, bacteria, algae, through to larger species like liverworts, and even trees with branches and roots that can be fossilized. And it's sort of a biochemical reaction where the biology is helping that facilitate and precipitate out, but it also relies on the dissolved carbon that's in these natural limestone streams degassing. This image, it just again highlights the importance of wood. So again, this is a natural multi-threaded stage 0 landscape on one of our limestone streams, and it's largely there because of the trees and the wood. So it's the supply of wood that allows the river the energy to change its shape and move across the landscape. And the bottom image on the right is particularly interesting. So that's coming down a steep valley side, and it's a combination of the wood and the tufa and the sedges that are growing there, which again stabilize that landscape and prevent it from incising and disconnecting over time. And then lastly, we're not going to miss out the beavers. Clearly, they are one of the prime architects of these stage 0 landscapes. And this is a fascinating site. So this is in the clay lowlands of the Ancombe catchment up near the Humber. And effectively, the beavers were put into a pond that wasn't really connected to any watercourses or even any drainage networks. And what you're seeing here is the beavers now terraforming the landscape to make a stage 0 landscape. So they've obviously dammed the outfall to the pond to raise water tables. They've also excavated a series of canals and ditches and even ponds across the landscape. And what they're doing is they're wetting it up, but they're not wetting it up with river water, they're wetting it up with rainwater. They're actually harnessing the power of the cohesivity of the clay and then trapping that to create an environment that suits them. So I've never seen that before, and it was just fantastic. So again, it just really highlights, again, the nature will do that if you have those keystone species back and you give it the time to do it, and it will do it pretty rapidly. So the next slide is our approach to restoring. So yeah, again, without intervention in these low energy systems, they're kind of trapped where they are forever. So again, this touches on some of the sort of bits that Matt covered in his presentation, the real importance of the detective work to try and understand what the past was, to kind of predict the future. And for that, you need to really understand the site before you come up with a design. So the image on the top right is a series of soil cores that were carried out in the old floodplain. And these were targeted in the paleo wetland, which you can see on the bottom left image. So that image was taken prior to restoration commencing. It was a snow melt incident, and you can see as it's starting to melt where the water's gathering in the old wetland that used to exist prior to drainage. And that straight line you can see in the background, that's the incised drainage ditch that they dug to try and drain this. And this core that I was talking about was taken in the centre of that wetland. And what you can see quite clearly is, looking from the top upwards, there is sort of a modern soil structure, quite clay and sandy. And then there is the modern alluvium, so sandy clay, which is extending down to just about the third section of the core. And then we have the more historic deposits, which again, more clay, some shelly fragments in there, but no gravels, mainly clays, a little bit of sand. And then we hit mudstone below. So from that and those series of cores, we already know that this is always a wetland environment. So therefore it was a deposition environment and therefore is suited to being stage 0. And when we match that up with the site investigations and the wetland that we can see, the paleo wetland, we know that this is the right site for the right restoration approach. Have we tried to put a single thread into this area? Well, it hasn't got any gravel for resupply. Eventually it would exhaust its gravel. So the only restoration option really that was viable was to go back to the past. So you can see there on the image on the right, when we filled the channel in, minor earthworks on this. We didn't change the topography. It was already showing that it was a paleo wetland, so there's no need to change that. So we just put the water back into its paleo wetland by filling in the old channel. As Matt said, there's challenges because this river's been heavily deepened for drainage, and that creates an artificial gradient. So when you lift the water back up out of its drainage ditch, you've got to somehow bring that higher water table back to meet the incised channel below. And you've got to, when you're doing these things, you've got to think about how nature would do this. How would nature create stage zero? And it probably would be something like beavers or tufa, and it probably wouldn't be gravel shoals or riffles forming, because these aren't gravel rich rivers. These are a bit like chalk streams. They're rivers that have tiny amount of gravel pushed by glaciation, and they don't have the resupply. And like I just said earlier, if they've got the clay overcapping these gravel deposits, it makes it very hard for the river to move laterally to mine new gravel sources. So yeah, sort of what I would say with gravel is you let the gravel travel, but with the willow, that's your longer term, that's your low energy, that's your catch. That's going to be your jams. And what we did there was we emulated beavers and we emulated tufa barriers by putting in a series of these just to gently drop the water surface back over a length. And hopefully what we'll see is it evolve in time into that nice wet woodlandy landscape we can see there. And this is really important because we need to dissipate that energy. And we need to dissipate that energy over as wide as an area as possible. Otherwise, we're going to have the risk of re-incision and water levels dropping and the site becoming less wet over time. So this is one of the benefits that we've got. So again, I think Matt referred to this earlier in his presentation. It comes from the same researchers that are looking at both Holnacott and Grange Farm and comparing. So it allows us to sort of look at two different systems, quite unique and different to each other. One with very little gravel, one with plenty of gravel, one with a very low gradient, the other with reasonable gradient, and compare the results and contrast. And what we can see here is the results pre-restoration. So again, die straight channel. And what we have there is this real change in velocity. Before the river can come up and out of bank to dissipate its energy, it's trapped within the channel, and that increases its stream power and it blasts life downstream. And what we can see afterwards is that energy dissipated and it just effectively gently rises up. That means life can get out of those flows. Really important for some of the smaller invertebrates and juvenile fish species that would otherwise be washed down over barriers and unable to recolonize again. So the hydrological changes, I think, for me, are one of the defining parameters of stage zero. So I think the valley side to valley side re-wetting is one of those key parameters. So if we're getting the whole of the valley bottom wet, then I think we're approaching or we're at stage zero. And I think it's got to be stable. So it's got to be a wet landscape and it's got to stay like that summer and winter. And I think for me, that's what I would call a defining characteristic of stage zero. I think there are other characteristics like the multi-thread channels. And I think this is an interesting example because this one doesn't necessarily have a multi-thread channel yet. It's got a wetland, but that will evolve, like Matt said. So I think it's interesting. But yeah, again, before and after, a couple of meters below water surface, actively losing water out of the channel bed, which is impressive when it's running over clay. And after fully charged aquifer, and actually it's been wetter in the summer than it has in the winter with water further up the valley sides, largely due to the biology acting as its own natural buffer. So as levels started to drop in the system when we hit drought, we had things like blanket weed and other plant matter then blocking the wood, which then raised water tables, buffering it. So almost like a positive feedback loop, which is rather lovely to see. And then we've got some nice results here, which are hydrological change. So it's a little bit complicated, but we have monitoring basically upstream of the site and on the site itself, and then just at the downstream end below the site. And what we're seeing here is the dark blue is the upstream monitoring, and we're seeing big spiky variations there in flow because the river has been heavily modified and very flashy and reactive. And then what we're seeing in the middle section, the red section, is the monitoring in the actual stage 0 channel itself, and massively reduced in terms of reactiveness and spikiness. Ignore the black bit, it's basically looking at the left and right hand side of the channel. And then the lower blue line that you can see at the bottom, that's the water leaving the channel. So yeah, whilst it's not as attenuated as when it's being spread across the actual big wide floodplain and all the wood and the biology there, it's still much less than the water entering the site. So it's giving us a natural flood management or reduction in how rapid and reactive and flashy the river is. And this is really important because these rivers, they should be groundwater fed, they should be limestone. They were in the past, and they are remarkably flashy. It's sort of within half a day's of rain, you've got 1.5 meter flow wave going down the river. So it's not at all a groundwater system where it would take months of aquifer recharge for that to suddenly rise. Here are some older examples, and these are really interesting. So again, going back to that name thing. So before stage 0 was a concept, we were doing drainage reversal, re-wetting. So obviously in our area, it's massively drained. So it seemed the logical thing to do. And these are some examples of sort of tributaries of River Wyvern that were carried out about 12 years ago. And they're basically sort of fenlandy sort of fenny sites. They're being re-wet, and they're little tributaries that come off the Wyvern. And effectively, what you're seeing here is the change over time to this fantastic wet landscape. And you can see some of the barriers on the right-hand side, sort of simple things like coir rolls that have been donated, wood structures, wherever they can really, to do a low-tech approach without bringing machines in. But it does create challenges because what this partner sites run by the Wildlife Trust has created is this fantastic, amazingly wet and floristically rich wet meadow system. However, it's got to the point it's so wet now that they're struggling then to do the hay cut. So we'll see it transition probably into a fen system, and that is natural processes after all. But then it brings a challenge with it that in such a nature depleted landscape where we have so few of these floristically rich meadows, do we want to be losing them? So it's an interesting conundrum of how wet do you want your valley floor to be, and worth sort of that discussion. And then this is another site, again, Wildlife Trust, different site, and we're looking at a more sandbed landscape this time, coming off Windblown Sands and Old Heathland, and effectively drained for attempting to get forestry harvesting out of it. And again, real simple, just adding the wood back into the system, just raising those water levels, trapping the fine sediment. And here we have, 12 years down the line, what's a beautiful wet woodland that's starting to form. And the birches, which are initial colonizing trees, are starting to die off, leaving sort of glades opening and marsh and meres and swamps forming. And you've got willows coming in over time as well. So again, a really nice example of just the low-tech approach. And then this is us being the beavers. So we have got beavers back in Lincolnshire, but they are in pen locations. We have a lot of drainage boards and flood engineers that would worry about our fenland systems and what beavers could do. So we haven't quite as yet got them naturalised, but I'm sure they'll come in time. But for the meantime, we can emulate their natural processes and basically copy what they do. So this is a slight upland site in the Wolds. Vaguely reminds me of being in the Lake District almost, if I squint and rub my eyes hard enough. But it's very different. We haven't got gravel. What we have is clay capping it. And farmers are very traditional. So they've dug great big drainage ditches through the valley bottom, but they've also dug drainage grips at the valley side. And we filled the grips in, and we have put beaver dams in as part of our works. And what you can see from, if you're looking at the two images using the tree as a guide marker, you can see that change over time. So we're starting to see in those yellow circles more lusher vegetation coming in. We're starting to see juncus, which is soft rush, a good wetland plant indicator coming in. And we're starting to see the river lift itself up. The water surface is much closer to the floodplain. And it's starting to move and laterally work itself. But I wouldn't say this is stage 0 yet. This is working towards stage 0. This isn't a full valley floor re-wet. We aren't seeing water from valley side to valley side, but we're working towards it. And this is a cheap and low-tech approach of doing it, and it's harnessing the river's available sediment supply. And the image to the right is looking at one of our willow beaver dam analogues. So again, this is something that we've done at an FM site working with farmers. Before actually I discovered a lot of Joe Wheaton's bits and pieces. And I think Joe himself says that, like, basically everybody thinks they come up with these ideas in isolation, but we're just reinventing the wheel with our own different take on it. So yeah, it's been lovely catching up with Joe, attending some of these things to look at these things, because yeah, like me, I see the future restoration being less excavator and more working with emulation and natural processes. Again, so this isn't a full stage 0. This is working towards that valley floor re-wet. So here, the river is in the background where the trees are, and effectively we have jammed the channel with wood to encourage it out of the bank more regularly. We've roughened up the floodplain to reduce the water being able to leave so readily, and we've roughened up the downstream entrance. And this is, or was, a natural stage 0 site. You can see it on maps and things. You can see the old wetland. But what's evolved in the meantime is an absolutely beautiful single thread river, which we've done a lot of work to, and is really, really quite special. So rather than take something out, which is quite nice, we want to give the river the options to pick and choose what it wants to do in the future. Give it the building blocks back, and it can choose whether it wants to be a single thread, whether it wants to multi-thread or whatever. So hence the adding the wood, adding the trees, adding the processes back in. And what we've noticed is that previous to doing the works, prior to intervention, maybe that water would come out of the bank, sit in the little wetland, and then it would drain away over the course of a week, whereas now we're at a couple of months of that water sitting on the landfill. So we're already having that hydrology, aquifer recharge benefits, which are so important. The other thing that Joe talks about with his beaver dam analog approach is using that to drive natural processes and channel evolution, so widening, sediment resupply. And this is an example from a sandbed system, just how successful that approach can be. So on our Witham, we talked about the clays. It makes it harder to move. We can get it to move, but it's a longer and slower process. But on these sandbed systems, I guess it's the equivalent of George's wandering gravel bed rivers that he was referring to up in on the glens in Northumberland. These are the lowland versions of those, high energy, lots of sediment supply, and yeah, you can see there it's driven widening of about 3 meters after one event, and it's raised bed by about 1 meter. And the idea was that perhaps a series of these tied in with trees eventually would be able to lift that river back up over time. And again, this is all working with what the river's got available, which is its sediment supply. Last couple of slides from me. So things to consider, future management. So some of our sites aren't wilding sites. They are still going to have to agriculturally work for the farmer. So I would much prefer not to see sheep on my lovely wetland grazing off my beautiful watercress and my plants that are colonising it. It's certainly slowed down its evolution, but at the same time, it's an important part of the story that these aren't nature parks, these are working landscapes. And I'm sure we can come to some agreement with the grazier to manage it a bit more sensitively, or perhaps fence off areas when we need to. The other thing to consider is that if you haven't addressed the fine sediment supply from upstream, they won't stay like this. But that's fine. That's like how rivers change. They need a sediment supply generally. So concluding thoughts, really sort of what I want to press upon us all here is that rivers effectively and restoration can take any form. There's a whole wide range of suite of available restoration techniques that are available to us. And that we should use sort of ground investigations in our catchment, understanding of both historic and current sediment supply, to sort of then inform what we're going to create over time, so there's no surprises. And that stage 0 landscapes can still be found across the UK, but often on a micro scale, often in those little headwater catchments, or even on the spring lines as a little mini valley, rather than necessarily some of the grander examples. And the biology in this is what really matters. It's driving the change. These are biologically driven systems, and that needs to be taken into account, and understanding whether some of those keystone sort of biological drivers are still there, and if we can't bring them back, then looking at emulating those. And really tying into that, sort of, you need to look at, when you're restoring these rivers, sort of looking at the past, present, and the future. So you need to be looking at your wood supply. Like, where's your wood going to come from to drive change in the future? Things like tree planting is a lot less glamorous than sort of big earth moving projects, but equally critical. And then just lastly, the fundamental building blocks for a healthy river is a clean river. So if we talk about tufa and all the biological processes at play there, the microorganisms, it's really important that we're not knocking out the bottom of the trophic pyramid, which drives all the change in these systems. So again, very important. And then just to finish on the last slide, there's the paper, link to the paper there that you can find from Richard Mason, and just a gratuitous opportunity to show a nice picture of the Northern Lights reflected in our stage 0 wetland. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Matt. Great presentation. We came across a few questions in the chat, and one really interesting about water temperature, because basically by achieving stage 0, you increase the water surface, so the potential solar radiation. And do you know, and by slowing the water as well, do you know if it does affect a lot the water temperature? First, for the key species targeted for restoration sometimes, and what is the impact of the rise of the water table on this temperature? And lastly, what would it be, following you, suitable for warmer climates?
Right, 3 really good questions and 3 technical questions there. So I'll have a go. You'll have to remind me what they are when I get sort of lose track partway through. So yes, to the first one. So yes, it does have impacts. We do see diurnal changes in temperature of water over the course of the day. Again, that future planting, future tree cover, we'll expect to see, as you get the marginal vegetation and the aquatic plants colonizing, the water levels will rise, which again will buffer that. And again, it provides some shade, but again, we've planted trees on it as well. It's a very open landscape, and in our area, they're not massively keen on the sort of nature side of things. It is about production. So there aren't that many trees, and what trees there are tend to be shrubbier, blackthorns. We don't have that sort of shaded, more wooded canopies. So again, we've added those back into the mix. And in response to what happens to the life and everything else that lives within it, it's really interesting. So effectively, life within the channel sort of migrates in and out during the time of the day. So if it starts to warm up, things just move into the deeper water, and then they come back up again. So there's a great deal of movement, both within the sort of things that live within the channel, sort of making local migrations, fish, invertebrates, that sort of thing. But on a summer's day, you can see that the wetlands dimpled with little fish feeding. So yeah, I'd imagine that probably come night time, they're moving around a bit more as you start to see perhaps oxygen levels changing.
Still with the monitoring questions and the indicators, we were wondering what are the key indicators to monitor? Well, there is, the groundwater table level, the biology, the question of indicators on migration of fish, the temperature, water temperature, or all range of potential indicators. But which are the indicators which have to be monitored precisely for each project with the feedback of experience for each project?
A good question. So I'm going to be honest. So something that we've maybe not been as hot on in the past was our monitoring. So it's one of these things that always gets missed in the hubbub of delivery. And I think probably one of my best decisions I've ever made in my career was involving myself with academics. They're the ones that are the masters of this, and that partnership, bringing in other people, it's where it's at. Like, you can be a good practitioner, but you know what? Nothing beats having your academic team behind you. And I'm lucky enough to have Notts Uni, Sweden UMEA, Southampton, Loughborough, Lincoln. So I've got some really good local experts there that I can sort of delegate some of this out to, that bring that added value and produce these amazing monitoring results for us, which would have taken me a lifetime to do on my own otherwise. So yeah, I think that sort of collaboration with academia and bringing that into practitioning is really important. And it's about knowing your skill set and delegating those things out. And things like drone surveys are a sort of a lower tech, lower interventional approach. But because this was a novel technique and it was being sort of introduced from the States effectively, I know Colin had done one up on the Bernard Mossop prior to this, but prior to that, this was really the first one, and Holnacott was just after. So I was very keen to make sure that we made the most of this, that we could compare the two sites. I wanted to sort of, they're two different landscapes. I wanted our evidence we were gathering to sort of, yeah, be useful for Holnacott and vice versa, and allow people to study that over time. And we took a slightly different approach. Like, we haven't intervened, or we've sat on our hands effectively since we've delivered the project to see how it evolves. Just for that context, because I know with Holnacott they were adding more wood and tweaking. So we just wanted to see what would happen if we didn't do those things. I think we are going to go back and tweak, but again, it's the beauty of having those two sites being delivered at roughly the similar time allows a really nice comparison, and having the same academics looking at both sites just adds more value.
Let's move on to the general discussion. We'll have several questions for several speakers now. And if Colin Thorne wants to take the floor, of course, he's most welcome. I wanted to ask you first question we've seen that one of the main concerns expressed through the various techniques is that of having the lowest possible carbon impact, allowing nature to choose its own pathway. It's sort of a passive restoration. And I'd like to have your views on this aspect of carbon intensity. Why would how do you choose to use mechanical engines to, like your machines, to do fill and cuts, and rather not cut and fill, rather leaving a former bed or open? And why do you fill it in some places? So I'd like to know why you made some choice. Who would like to answer that first? How did you make the choice in terms of carbon footprint for the project?
I can make a quick comment. It's George here. I think it's a very key point. But the targeting of interventions is very important here. Wholesale resetting of valley floor topography is obviously very carbon intensive, whereas small removal of bits of embankment on tributaries and local channel blocking are probably the least carbon intensive of all. And employing that approach plus reuse of all materials on site then cuts down on transport of materials into schemes. So I would just advocate always looking at the potential for restarting geomorphological processes at key points in the landscape. And if we've certainly found if you can achieve that, then you can actually have some widespread rejuvenation of the system and the ecology with very minimal intervention.
Do you want me to go next? I don't mind adding my 2 pence worth in. So for me, it's been my pressure of my peers. So if I make the mistake of showing any of my images to my wider geomorphologists that work at the Environment Agency, for the first questions they'll ask is, how do you justify spending that much money? And what about the carbon? So what you've seen when we started there was the more carbon heavy projects where we were using machines, and you're seeing a definite transgression towards using people power and volunteers and things to do it low cost and low tech. So it's that industry steer that steers us down the path often, as well as what the landowner will let you do.
Yeah, and I will just go lastly. I think the two contrasting case studies, I think, which I presented, one was clearly more carbon intensive than the other one. I think that the starting point would be always to try to aim to deliver something with less carbon pressures, and also working with your geomorphological processes as well. But ultimately, there is a degree of client steer, client push to what design they want to achieve as well.
Could I just one more point on that? I think it's really important to also consider the impacts of the work, and rejuvenation of valley floor wetland areas has been shown by numerous scientific studies now to be one of the key approaches to capture carbon. You know, the sequestration rates on those systems is far better than forestry. And they work straight away. We don't need to wait 20 years for the things to grow. So it's an argument that needs to be pushed much more strongly, I think, in terms of a driver for this work into the future.
That's an important point, George, and certainly for the ALA scheme, I don't have the figures to hand, but there was an element of work which was done to look at that longer term carbon storage and what the benefits would be.
And so do you think you will have the same impact with really heavy interventionism like in the US? They made really heavy machinery all along like long stretches of river. Do you think they will have as well this return? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I think we're working at a completely different scale.
Yeah,
I would say in the UK to what we see in the US in terms of the scale of the machinery and the intensity of the way construction works are carried out.
Well, I would say
I don't know about the scale of some of those US projects. Maybe Colin could comment, but when we can say that we're completely wetting up floodplains of the order of 3-4 kilometers or so, that's significant. And if we're starting to do it on that scale across the country, then it's going to make a difference. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
my sort of 2 pence worth on this is that often our rivers have high sediment loads, so you can work with that. You can harness that sediment load. So in George's examples is gravel coming down, so we can work with that to harvest that gravel. Like we can drive process from the upper catchment to give us gravel supply. And then in my and Matt's is actually a very good example of that, where the gravel's naturally moved through and is moved on to the floodplain and it's being reworked by the river. And then mine is the clays and sands. It's an anthropogenic supply, but it's a supply. And there comes a point where perhaps going back's maybe not achievable. Going back to a limestone river when it's got 3 meters of sandy clay sitting over the top of it, it's probably it's not as achievable, and it may be that we're restoring forward, not backwards.
I take advantages to call Colin Thorne because he knows he has a good experience feedback from the US, so that he could possibly confirm the carbon impact. Colin, are you with us? Colin, are you here?
Yeah, sure. I can just report that with the carbon effects, the experience gained by the Forest Service and that gained by the US Fish and Wildlife Service suggests that the carbon capture in the restored systems is so efficient that it more than compensates for the carbon emitted during construction within just a few years. Because that very much was a concern of people like Jared McKee, who wrote papers on this. But now the jury is back, and it looks like the greater carbon capture, as demonstrated particularly by Dr. Ellen Wohl at Colorado State University, means that you have to speculate to accumulate. Sometimes you have to burn some carbon to capture more carbon in the long run. But as today's speakers have said, every case is different. Every case must be treated on its merits. Often it isn't practical to get the full floodplain back. Well, get what you can. Do the best you can, and be happy with that. But where you can reset the whole valley floor, take the opportunity, because it will reward much more richly.
In addition, I have a question, another question, which is the impact on the groundwater tables, which rise, and especially the surface temperature and fish migration. It was said that the fact that you multi-channel fish migration is not blocked by multi-channel rivers. And another impact, which is not necessarily negative, despite the rising of the groundwater tables. Now, in terms of temperature, do you have results or works? I've studied this point for the beaver.
For the monitoring of temperature is underway for the. I don't have any figures to hand though, but that data is being collected and monitored, along with the groundwater levels as well. So we would hope there'll be some some papers coming soon to demonstrate what the benefits are for that.
Yeah, the same for me as well. The data is out there and it's being looked at, but yeah, I haven't got that to hand. We have got water quality looked at as well, things like phosphates, and suspended sediments, but again, we haven't got that data analysed. It's that thing of you need to be running for a length of time to have that longer term data set. I think it's going to change over time.
Colin, any contribution in that domain?
So yeah, this is quite a complex question, because for many years in the USA, they've been monitoring the temperature upstream of the project and downstream of the project. They see very little change, and that sounds a little disappointing if the water is artificially warm, which is often the problem. But if you monitor temperature within the project reach, you discover very high diversity. So in some floodplain ponds, they're unshaded, the sunlight penetration is very strong, the water is very warm. That's bad for cold water fishes, but it produces a primary productivity hotspot where the microorganisms are extremely successful, the nutrient cycling happens very quickly, and they are food factories right at the bottom of the food chain. So having some hot ponds is a good thing. On the other hand, the hyperrheic water is cruel because it stays underground for periods. And when it reemerges and mixes with the water in the stream, you get a cooling effect, which is beneficial. And where you have springs, which now rehydrate the aquifer, this is George's point, that a lot of the water in the floodplain doesn't come from the river. it comes from the groundwater, it comes from drainage from the hillsides. That water, again, if it is spring water, is going to be nearly constant temperature throughout the year. This is great because it cools the water in the summer and it prevents freezing in the winter. And we've seen many advantages to overwintering fish from the cold water that is spring-fed. So diversity and variability in temperature increase very, very significantly, even though maybe the average temperature doesn't change much.
All right, thank you. We have another question, and which is to me really relevant to that kind of project, because as they take a lot of space, what was the initial need of the creation of these different projects that we've seen today? So what was the fuel that that made the start of this kind of project, even though they limit soil and agricultural use of the land that they're on?
Shall I jump in then? So for us, our parameters were water availability. So really heavily drained agricultural catchment, massive ranges, boom and bust on water levels. So we can go from flood just from a few hours of rainfall in the catchment to drought literally a week later when all that water's been pushed out the system and out to sea. So you have these massive ranges where we're in flood, we're in drought, and the rivers are drying up. They've already started, the headwaters have started working their way down. So for us, the water recharge was what we were going for. We wanted a resilient river that was going to be there for the future, and rivers don't work if they haven't got flow going down them. So that was a main parameter. We knew that we're a very nutrient heavy catchment, so we wanted to go with the water quality improvements. We're hoping that as plants become more established, we'll start to see that uptake of the suspended sediments and phosphates. And we wanted to improve the biology most of all. And what you saw there was a ditch, a very hostile ditch that in the summer is choked with reeds and there's no open water. Come winter, when the reeds die back, everything's flumed out. So it just had no fish in it when we came to do the rescue. And we're certainly catching more fish there than when we started from. So it's those principles really.
And for the River Aller and also the Devon examples I gave, I think one of the drivers would be the Water Framework Directive and bringing about some of the improvements which Matt's just mentioned. But I think the other one is a landowner with an appetite for change and a landowner with an appetite for implementing this type of scheme. I think that's often a really big challenge. The two examples I presented, we were very lucky that we were working with one landowner who owned and managed an extensive area. It's much more challenging where you have a mosaic of different landowners. And that's where we can see small, more fragmented schemes. It's very different in the UK. It can be quite difficult in the UK to get landowners together to deliver schemes. Not impossible, but definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I think for us, you can look back in history a little bit, and the initial funding that we got for a lot of our projects was linked to flooding and the potential for some form of flood management upstream of key areas. As Matt Parr mentioned, the phosphate became a funding source, and more recently we've certainly seen that with government incentives that biodiversity and links to climate have started to drive funds towards these projects as well. But it's interesting, Matt Hemsworth mentioned there it's still very opportunist and very much linked to interested and progressive landowners rather than the majority. The money is starting to sway more people, but it does remain a challenge. But I think we'd all agree as practitioners with a keen interest in the science that the challenge is half the fun. If we didn't enjoy a challenge, we certainly wouldn't be doing this as a career.
Oh, yeah.
We'll end with a flush question. You'll have 1 minute each. The answer is not easy, but nevertheless, are there any minimum scale or minimum slope or minimum length of river for this to work? Or can the method be used at any scale, any slope, any river flow?
Ask a beaver.
You going, Matt, or me?
That was me done in
Shall
a
I?
minute. Ask a beaver.
Oscar Beaver. Yeah. Well, I certainly think it can be done at any scale, on any system, regardless. You just got to do the right thing in the right place, and every little bit counts.
Yeah, I agree with George. I think then I just add to that. As we just discussed, I think today there's lots of different approaches. We don't just have one approach to this type of restoration, and I think it's choosing the right approach to the site you're working within and the catchment you're working within.
Sorry, I'd like to do a little zoom on the availability for material. I'll share the screen. There is a website which gives the elements available on this stage 0 notion or concept, which is an initial website and which includes a map of the zones of work. We see in Europe, we got a couple of examples, but not many. And therefore, behind this database and these elements available on the stage 0 concept, you see other elements associated with the techniques, the low-tech systems, including a site, but the Utah State University, which talks about the stage 0 concept and the techniques to restore the divagation stage, be it floodplain or sometimes just in the minor riverbed. And last element, the English British site on the River Restoration Center, which also has documentary results. I would like to conclude simply by thanking all the speakers and the interpreter who's okay. And I would like to thank H2O Lyon, who will have the closing word. Maybe one word from each of the speakers. Maybe one quick conclusion word. In your opinion, gentlemen, what is your hope or your viewpoint about the development of this technique in the UK and elsewhere in the world? Well, flash answer.
Wetter is better.
Yeah, give more space to the rivers to adapt and change.
Yeah, completely. Process-based restoration approach, and we'll achieve this. Absolutely.
Thank you. I will give the floor to H2O Lyon to conclude the webinar. Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Arnaud. Thank you, Matt, George, Matthew, and Colin for this brilliant presentation. It was a rich presentation. Thank you for all those who stayed till the end. And we always try to provide knowledge, information on all the techniques, deadwood, then the stage 0 today. We also did a series on beavers. So next fall, we'll come up with new proposals, other webinars we organize with Antoine. Thank you. And thank you all to all speakers, Antoine and Arnaud, for all 2 master students. And Arnaud was still a master student and has great job. Thank you all.